On a Prayer, Faith is Awaken by Elton Thomas, Episode 7, Searching for Light. Dusty's car rolled to a stop in front of a crumbling tenement on the city's south side. The building, once a beacon of promise in the heart of St. Louis, now sagged under the weight of time and neglect. The paint had long since peeled away, exposing the bare brick beneath. Windows were either broken or boarded up, and the graffiti that covered the lower walls spoke of a place where hope had been abandoned long ago. Dusty leaned back in his seat, his fingers drumming lightly on the steering wheel as he scanned the street for any sign of movement. His gaze lingered on the shadows pooling in the alleyways, the figures huddled in doorways. It was a neighborhood that wore its despair openly, where the forgotten and the forsaken had made their home. He exhaled slowly, the weariness settling into his bones. The past few days had been a whirlwind of dead ends, each lead dissolving into nothing as soon as he reached it. And yet, here he was again, chasing another faint thread that might, just might, bring him closer to finding Mila. The frustration gnawed at him, but it was the weight of responsibility that pressed hardest on his chest. The thought of that little girl, scared and alone, kept him going. He couldn't let her down. The tip from a local informant had brought him here, to this forgotten corner of the city. A few whispered words about a man who had seen a girl fitting Mila's description. Dusty had learned not to put too much stock in rumors, but he couldn't afford to overlook anything. Not now. He opened the car door and stepped out, the cold air biting at his face. It was the kind of chill that cut straight through, leaving a dull ache in his bones. Pulling his jacket tighter around him, he made his way toward the building, his boots crunching against the gravel-strewn sidewalk. The street was eerily quiet, save for the occasional distant honk of a car or the muffled voices of people passing by. Dusty kept his head on a swivel, his instincts sharpened by years of field work. He could feel the eyes on him, the curious, cautious stares of people who knew better than to get involved. He approached the entrance to the building, the door hanging crookedly on its hinges. Inside, the hallway was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb, casting long, wavering shadows on the cracked walls. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay, mixed with the faint tang of old cigarettes. Dusty's jaw clenched as he moved further inside, his steps slow and deliberate. His eyes scanned the hallway, searching for anything out of place. He reached the first door on his left and knocked lightly. No answer. He moved to the next, repeating the process, but all he was met with was silence. It wasn't until he reached the end of the hallway that he heard it. A faint, shuffling sound, followed by the low murmur of voices behind a door marked with peeling paint. Dusty's heart rate quickened, his hand instinctively moving to the gun at his hip, but he stopped himself. This wasn't the time for force. Not yet. He rapped on the door, keeping his voice steady. "It's Dusty Rhymes. I just need to talk." The murmuring stopped, and for a few seconds, there was nothing but silence. Then, slowly, the door creaked open, revealing a narrow crack through which a single wary eye peeked out. "You alone?" The voice was rough, suspicious. Dusty nodded. "Yeah, just looking for some information." The door opened a little wider, revealing a man in his late 50s. His face was worn and hollow, his eyes shadowed by exhaustion. Dusty recognized the look. It was the look of someone who had seen too much, lived through too much, and come out the other side with nothing left to hold on to. The man's clothes hung loosely on his frame, as if he hadn't eaten properly in days. "Come in," the man muttered, stepping back to let Dusty inside. The apartment was small and bare, the furniture sparse and mismatched. A single window at the far end let in just enough light to make out the outlines of the room. The man shuffled toward a worn-out chair, sinking into it with a heavy sigh. Dusty remained standing, his eyes sweeping the room before settling on the man. "They call you Miles, right?" Dusty asked, his voice calm but firm. The man nodded, his hands resting limply in his lap. "That's what they call me," he replied, his voice tinged with resignation. Dusty pulled a chair over and sat across from him, leaning forward slightly. "I'm looking for a girl, Mila Suero. She's 8 years old. Disappeared a few days ago." Miles's face twitched at the mention of the name, his gaze dropping to the floor. Dusty didn't miss the reaction. His pulse quickened, a glimmer of hope sparking in his chest. I've heard you might have seen something, Dusty continued, his voice softening just a little, coaxing. Anything you can tell me would help. Miles rubbed his hands together, the skin dry and cracked. For a long moment he didn't speak, his eyes distant as if he were trying to pull the memory from the dark recesses of his mind. When he finally did speak, his voice was low and strained. I saw a van, Miles muttered, his words barely above a whisper. Black, no plates. It came through here 3 nights ago, late, real late. I was out in the alley. Saw the van stop. 2 guys got out, grabbed something or someone, and threw her in the back. Dusty's heart hammered in his chest, but he kept his expression neutral. You're sure it was a girl? Miles nodded slowly, his eyes haunted. Yeah, she was crying. I heard her just for a second before they slammed the door shut. Dusty swallowed hard, his stomach twisting. He had expected as much, but hearing it made it all too real. Mila had been taken, and every second that passed made finding her more difficult. Did you see where they went? Dusty asked, his voice edged with urgency. Miles shook his head, his gaze dropping back to his hands. No. They drove off fast. I didn't follow. Didn't want to get involved. You know how it is. Dusty did know. People in neighborhoods like this had learned not to ask questions, not to get involved, but that didn't make it any easier to hear. Thanks, Miles, Dusty said quietly, rising to his feet. He pulled a card from his jacket pocket and handed it to the man. If you remember anything else, call me. Miles nodded, though Dusty wasn't sure he would ever hear from him again. He turned to leave, but just as his hand reached for the door, Miles spoke again, his voice rough and hesitant. Be careful, Dusty, Miles said, his eyes dark with fear. The people who took that girl, they're dangerous. They don't leave loose ends. Dusty paused, his jaw tightening. He knew exactly who he was dealing with, and he had no illusions about the danger. But he had no choice. Mila was out there, and he wasn't about to let fear stop him. He left the building, the cold air hitting him like a slap as he stepped back onto the street. His mind raced with the information he had gathered. A black van, 2 men, no plates. It wasn't much, but it was something. Dusty walked back to his car, his breath misting in the frigid air. The streets were still quiet, the city cloaked in the eerie calm of night. But Dusty knew better. Beneath the surface, in the shadows where no one looked, something far darker was moving, and he was getting closer. He climbed into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel as he stared out at the empty street. His heart was heavy with the weight of it all, the uncertainty, the fear. But there was no time for doubt. Mila was counting on him, and he wasn't going to stop until he brought her home.